Right now, as you are watching this, there is something quietly destroying the most expensive part of your home. It is not termites. It is not a leaking pipe. It is a thin, green layer of moss sitting on your roof, soaking up moisture like a sponge and slowly prying your shingles apart from the inside out. Most homeowners never think twice about it. They glance up, see a little green fuzz, and assume it is just a cosmetic issue. But by the time they finally call a contractor, the damage is already done. The shingles are curling, the wood deck underneath is rotting, and the estimate comes back somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 for a full replacement. Here is what makes this story so frustrating. There is a white powder, a simple mineral compound that kills every trace of moss and algae on a roof in 2 to 3 weeks. It costs roughly $10 to $20 at any garden center. A single application can protect your roof for up to 2 years, and you do not have to climb a ladder, scrub a single shingle, or hire anyone. So why have most homeowners never heard of it? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something far more predictable and, honestly, far more interesting. It is a story about economics, about a mineral that nobody can patent, and about the ancient science of metals that shaped some of the most magnificent buildings in human history. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we are cracking open one of the most practical chapters of forgotten knowledge you will ever encounter. We are going to explore the science of ancient copper roofs, a 19th century cholera epidemic that accidentally revealed the secret to building preservation, and the simple chemistry that could save you thousands of dollars. Let us get into it. Part 1. The Invisible Invasion. To understand the solution, you first need to understand the enemy. When you see that patch of green on a roof, you are not looking at ordinary plant growth. Moss is one of the most ancient organisms on the planet. It has been around for roughly 450 million years, long before flowering plants, long before trees. And unlike most plants, moss does not have roots. It does not have a vascular system to transport water internally. Instead, it absorbs moisture directly through its cell walls, like a living sponge. What moss does have are structures called rhizoids, microscopic thread-like anchors that physically grip into the tiny pores and crevices of asphalt shingles. As the moss colony expands, these rhizoids wedge deeper between the shingle layers, creating gaps that were never supposed to be there. Now here is where the real damage begins. Moss holds enormous amounts of water against the roof surface. In cold climates, that water freezes overnight, expands, and then thaws during the day. Every single freeze-thaw cycle acts like a tiny pry bar, physically splitting and cracking the shingle material a little more each time. Roofers sometimes call this the Pry Bar Effect, and it is devastatingly effective. Over 2 to 3 years of unchecked growth, the cumulative damage becomes catastrophic. Shingles curl upward at the edges. The adhesive seal that prevents wind uplift breaks apart. The underlayment saturates with moisture, and the wooden roof deck, the structural layer that holds your entire roof together, begins to rot from the inside out. By the time you notice a problem, you are not looking at a cleaning job. You are looking at a replacement. And with the average roof replacement in America now running between $21,000 and $30,000, according to 2025 industry data, this is not a small problem. Part 2. The Architectural Secret of Ancient Roofs. So here is a question worth asking. Modern roofs are engineered with advanced synthetic materials, UV-resistant coatings, and decades of polymer science. Yet the average asphalt shingle roof lasts 15 to 25 years. Meanwhile, some of the oldest buildings in the world have stood for centuries with their roofs virtually untouched by organic growth. What did the ancients know that we seem to have forgotten? To find the answer, we need to travel back to medieval northern Europe. Long before anyone manufactured asphalt shingles, builders across Scandinavia and the British Isles discovered something remarkable through simple observation. Churches topped with copper plates stayed completely moss-free for generations. The copper roofs remained pristine and beautiful, while every wooden and stone structure around them turned green and decayed within a decade. The parishioners noticed it. The builders noticed it. But for centuries, nobody understood why. They just knew the pattern was undeniable. If a roof had copper on it, nothing organic would grow. One of the most extraordinary surviving examples is Christ Church in Philadelphia, built between 1727 and 1744. Its copper roof, made from sheets imported from England, became the subject of a corrosion study published in the journal Corrosion. After 213 years of exposure, researchers found the copper had weathered less than 0.02 of an inch. The roof required its first significant maintenance only after roughly 2 centuries of continuous service. That is not a typo. 200 years. Now, to be fair and accurate, copper roofing has real drawbacks. It is enormously expensive to install, roughly 20 times the cost of asphalt per square foot. It is heavy, requiring a stronger roof structure. And Christ Church has undergone periodic restorations over the centuries, as any building that old would. But the fundamental point stands. The copper surface resisted biological growth in a way that no other common roofing material could match. And the science behind why that happens is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of building preservation. Part 3. Cholera, Copper, and the Oligodynamic Effect. The breakthrough that finally explained the mystery of pristine copper roofs came from an entirely unexpected place: a cholera epidemic in 19th century Paris. In 1852, a French physician named Victor Burq visited a copper smelting facility in the 3rd arrondissement of Paris. The conditions were terrible. The housing was poor. The hygiene was worse. By every measure, these workers should have been among the most vulnerable people in the city during the cholera outbreaks that devastated Paris in 1832, 1849, and 1852. But they were not. All 200 workers at that facility had been completely spared from cholera. When Burq investigated further, he discovered that 400 to 500 additional copper workers on the same street had also somehow escaped the disease. In the 1854 to 1855 epidemic, he could not find a single death among jewelers, goldsmiths, or boilermakers, all professions that involved daily contact with copper. Burq spent 15 years investigating this phenomenon. He visited over 400 factories across Paris, collected data from England, Sweden, and Russia, covering more than 200,000 people in the copper industry, and in 1867, he presented his findings to the French Academies of Science and Medicine. His conclusion? Regular contact with copper provided a powerful protective effect against cholera. Decades later, in 1893, a Swiss botanist named Carl Wilhelm von Nageli finally gave this phenomenon a scientific name: the oligodynamic effect. He discovered that certain heavy metals, specifically copper and zinc, are incredibly lethal to algae, mold, fungi, and microorganisms, even in microscopic concentrations. Just a few metallic ions dissolved in water could destroy entire colonies of organic growth. For the next 80 years, this science quietly shaped the architecture of the most important buildings in the Western world. Copper roofs became the gold standard for cathedrals, universities, and government monuments, not just for their beauty, but for their biological resistance. And in 1973, researchers at Battelle Columbus Laboratories compiled a landmark literature review spanning 312 scientific citations across 8 decades of research, confirming the devastating power of copper and zinc against molds, fungi, and algae. The science was clear, the evidence was overwhelming. And then, in the most predictable twist imaginable, almost nobody told homeowners about it. Part 4. Why nobody told you. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is where a lot of content creators go wrong. There is no shadowy cabal of roofing executives meeting in a dark room, plotting to suppress zinc sulfate. The reality is both simpler and more frustrating than a conspiracy. Today, approximately 75 to 80% of all residential roofs in America are made of asphalt shingles. The U.S. roofing contractor industry generates roughly $76 billion in annual revenue. The average shingle roof lasts 15 to 25 years, and replacement plus repair costs totaled nearly $31 billion in 2024 alone. The entire business model depends on a predictable cycle of deterioration and replacement. That is not evil, that is just how the economics work. But here is the key insight. Zinc sulfate is a naturally occurring mineral. You cannot patent it. No corporation can own it. There is no way to build a recurring subscription model around something that exists freely in the earth and costs a few dollars per application. Think about what that means from a marketing perspective. No patent means no exclusive product to sell. No exclusive product means no marketing budget. No marketing budget means no advertising, no sponsored content, no placement in home improvement shows. And what is not promoted eventually fades from public awareness. Meanwhile, the solutions that are promoted, the professional moss removal services charging $500 to $1,000 per visit, the chemical roof treatments sold in premium packaging, those do have profit margins. Those do have marketing budgets. Those do show up in your search results. And the real tragedy is what happens when homeowners try to solve the problem themselves. Every year, thousands of people rent pressure washers and blast their roofs with thousands of pounds of concentrated water force, thinking they are protecting their investment. What they are actually doing is stripping away the tiny ceramic granules that protect asphalt from ultraviolet radiation. The roof looks clean, but it is now exposed to direct sunlight and will crack and blister years before its time. Most major shingle manufacturers, including GAF and Owens Corning, explicitly state in their warranty documentation that pressure washing voids your warranty. Part 5. The molecular assassination. So how do we harness the power of the oligodynamic effect today without installing a copper roof that costs more than a new car? The answer is zinc sulfate monohydrate, a simple inorganic compound sold as a white crystalline powder at garden centers and hardware stores. Here is what happens when you use it. When you sprinkle this powder along the peak of your roof, it lies dormant, waiting for rain. When the rain comes, water dissolves the zinc particles and carries them slowly downward across every shingle surface. Mosses are uniquely vulnerable to this because, as we discussed earlier, they lack a protective outer layer. They absorb water directly through their cell walls. When the zinc-laden solution washes over them, the zinc ions penetrate the moss tissue and begin disrupting its internal chemistry. Researchers believe one key mechanism involves the zinc ions interfering with the magnesium at the center of the chlorophyll molecule. Without functional chlorophyll, the moss cannot photosynthesize. It is essentially blinded to sunlight. The zinc ions also trigger oxidative stress that breaks down cell walls from the inside out. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, the moss starves, turns brown, dries out, and naturally detaches from the roof surface, washing away in the rain. No scrubbing, no pressure washing, no climbing on the roof with a wire brush, just the quiet, efficient chemistry of a metallic ion doing what nature designed it to do. I want to be honest about the limitations here because credibility matters more than hype. Zinc sulfate provides protection for roughly 1 to 2 years per application. It is not permanent. You will need to reapply it periodically, especially in wet, shaded climates where moss thrives. And it does not reverse damage that has already occurred. If your shingles are already curling and your deck is rotting, zinc sulfate will not fix that. You need a roofer. What it does is prevent the biological damage from starting in the first place, which is vastly cheaper than dealing with the consequences. Part 6. How to apply it and how to do it responsibly. According to Oregon State University Extension Service, the standard application is about 3 pounds of zinc sulfate powder for every 600 square feet of roof surface. You can apply it dry or mix it with water for spraying. Wait for a dry day with no rain forecast for at least 48 hours. Using a simple garden scoop or a pole-mounted applicator, sprinkle the powder evenly along the ridge line of your roof. Gravity and the next rain will distribute the zinc ions downward across the entire surface. You do not even need to climb up. But here, we need to pause and talk about responsibility. The same trait that makes zinc sulfate lethal to moss also makes it dangerous to aquatic ecosystems. According to the Oregon State University research and the EPA guidelines, zinc runoff can be highly toxic to freshwater fish, particularly salmon and trout, as well as aquatic invertebrates. If you use zinc sulfate, you must manage your downspouts. Disconnect them temporarily and direct the initial runoff into a vegetated area or a patch of soil. The earth itself acts as a natural filter, binding the zinc ions before they can reach waterways. Also, do not use zinc sulfate if you have copper gutters or downspouts. Zinc corrodes copper, which would be ironic given what we have been discussing. For homeowners in environmentally sensitive areas near streams, rivers, or salmon habitats, you have alternatives. Potassium-based fatty acid products kill moss by breaking down cell membranes and are more biodegradable. You can also install zinc strips along your ridgeline, which release tiny amounts of zinc with each rain and can suppress moss growth for 3 to 5 years. And the simplest long-term strategy of all, trim back the trees that shade your roof. Moss needs shade and moisture to thrive. Let the sunlight in and you change the environment itself. Part 7. What the ancients understood that we forgot. Let us step back and look at the bigger picture for a moment. What we have traced in this video is a thread of knowledge that stretches back centuries. Medieval builders observed that copper killed organic growth. A French physician in the 1850s confirmed that copper protected people from cholera. A Swiss botanist in the 1890s named the science behind it. Researchers in the 1970s compiled the definitive evidence. And today, you can walk into a garden center and buy the mineral that harnesses that exact same science for less than the cost of a pizza. The story of zinc sulfate is not a story about suppression. It is a story about what happens to knowledge when there is no financial incentive to promote it. Our ancestors built structures that lasted centuries because they paid attention to the natural world and worked with its chemistry instead of against it. Today, we live in an economy where the most effective solutions often get the least attention, simply because nobody can make a recurring profit from them. Think about that the next time you are choosing between a $20 bag of mineral powder and a $1,000 professional treatment. Think about it the next time someone tells you the old ways are obsolete and only the latest products will do. The knowledge was never lost, it was just never promoted. Here is what I want you to take away from this. First, inspect your roof this season. Look for moss, especially on the north-facing slopes and under tree cover. Second, if you find moss, try zinc sulfate before you call a contractor. The cost is minimal, the science is proven, and you might save yourself thousands of dollars. Third, manage the runoff responsibly. Protect your local waterways. And fourth, share this with a homeowner who needs it. This is the kind of practical, actionable knowledge that makes a real difference in real life. Thank you for watching. If this video opened your eyes, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who is about to spend $10,000 they do not need to spend. Until next time, stay curious, stay self-reliant, and welcome back to Historia Prime.